where should I begin? You know, in recent weeks, there's been a lot of discussion about some vulnerabilities in encrypted email, and it kind of illustrates how the threat model has changed so much for encrypted email. Back when I first developed PGP, it was, you know, on MS-DOS. It was for your computer attached to a modem that dialed up a mail server somewhere and uploaded and downloaded your email and then turned off the modem. And now you can decrypt it. You can, you know, write it out to a file, decrypt it, you know, read it. And that was, you know, it's a pretty simple threat model. Today, email has an enormous attack surface. What I do mostly for my secure communications is to use messaging apps and secure VoIP. For the past 15 years, I've been working on mostly secure VoIP and then more recently secure messaging. With secure VoIP, you have a unique environment that doesn't exist in any other communication situation, and that is that you have two human beings in the loop. They're participating in the. They are available. The human brains and the human common sense and human judgment are available to participate in authenticating the exchange and to do a detection of the man-in-the-middle attack. That's not the case for any other, you know, it's not the case for text messaging, it's not the case for encrypted email. It's unique to secure VoIP. And so one of the things that I learned over the years with PGP is that with PGP, you either, well, you can have your public keys signed by someone else, and then you have to worry about, you know, is that someone else trusted by enough people that they're going to accept your public key. And, you know, you have a grassroots, bottom-up trust model, or you have a top-down trust model, like in the PKI world. In either case, it's a high cognitive burden for the user. And with secure VoIP, you can bypass public key infrastructures, and you can have just Alice and Bob directly participate in authenticating the exchange. So what we do with secure VoIP is, at least in the protocol that I developed, ZRTP, you do a Diffie-Hellman key exchange. It's an ephemeral Diffie-Hellman exchange. That gives you forward secrecy. The keys are created at the beginning of the call. They are destroyed at the end of the call. This gives you, you know, you could do this without a public key infrastructure. One of the things that happens after you do the Diffie-Hellman exchange is that you can, at the end of it, you're supposed to have Alice and Bob both using the same session key. That's how you can tell there's no man in the middle. If Alice and Bob are using the same session key, then there's no man in the middle attack. A man in the middle attack is, you know, recently I've been doing press interviews with journalists that keep using the word man in the middle attack for every conceivable form of wiretapping. You know, if there's malware injection onto your computer and then it exfiltrates your keys, oh, that's a man-in-the-middle attack. Well, no, it's not. You know, there's man-in-the-middle attack is a specific kind of attack, and it requires that there's someone in the middle that impersonates the other party, both parties, impersonates both parties to, you know, they think they're talking to each other, but they're really talking to the man in the middle. So that means that in the man-in-the-middle attack, the two parties at the endpoints are not using the same session key. They've negotiated with an ephemeral Diffie-Hellman exchange two different sessions with the man in the middle. And that means that the session keys, which are randomly generated each time by the ephemeral Diffie-Hellman exchange, are going to be different. And so if there's a way that you could tell if your session keys are different, then you can detect the man-in-the-middle attack. And so if you display a hash of the session keys and truncate the hash so that you don't have to do a full fingerprint comparison, and you see that, let's say down to 2 bytes, and you compare those 2 bytes and they differ, it proves completely unambiguously that there's definitely a man-in-the-middle attack. Now, some of you may be concerned that we truncate the hash. And when you do a PGP fingerprint compare, you compare the entire hash of the public key, which is, you know, pretty long. It's not something your mom is ever going to do. And it has a high cognitive burden. And, you know, if you ever want to see just how nerdy that can get, go to a PGP key signing party. It's, you know, you've never seen nerdiness reach that level when you have a whole bunch of PGP enthusiasts comparing the hashes of their public keys. So for an ephemeral phone call, you want to be able to compare just 2 bytes, which we use the PGP word list for. So you just compare 2 words. But we have something else in the protocol that makes it safe to do this, because if you just truncate the hash, then it becomes possible for the man in the middle to try to find birthday collisions between a Diffie-Hellman exchange here and a Diffie-Hellman exchange to the other party. And to prevent that, we do hash commitment. That means that when I send you my public key for Diffie-Hellman, my G to the X public key, I don't send it to you right away. I send you a hash of it in advance. And then you send me your G to the X or G to the Y public key. And then when I have that, I send you the actual G to the X public key. Now you can compute the hash of that and compare it to the hash I just sent a second ago and see if it's the same. This puts the man in the middle in a position where he doesn't know the public keys of either Alice or Bob before he has to generate his own public keys, which means that he can't control this truncated hash. He only gets one guess. And if it's a 2-byte truncated hash, if it's a 16-bit truncated hash, that means he only has one chance out of 65,000 of getting it right, of getting a man-in-the-middle attack without detection. And those are suicidal odds. He's not going to do that. It's too risky. Only one chance in 65,000 of a successful man-in-the-middle attack without detection. He won't play the game. And so that's how ZRTP uses the humans to verify against a man-in-the-middle attack. We don't need a public key infrastructure. We don't need certificate authorities. We don't even need trust on first use, which is what you have with SSH, for example. You don't need a lot of things that are fairly complex to do in other scenarios where you don't have 2 humans in the game. But we also add something to ZRTP that makes it unnecessary to verbally compare this short authentication string on every call. I said that you destroy the keys at the end of the call. Well, before you destroy the session key, you compute a hash of the session key and you store it in a local cache. And it's indexed by the identity of the other user. And when you call the same person again later, you do a fresh Diffie-Hellman exchange like you did the first time. And you derive a session key not only from the Diffie-Hellman calculations results, but also you mix in the hash of yesterday's session key. So now you have a new session key that's a product of the old session key from last time, plus the fresh random Diffie-Hellman that you just did for this call. And that means that if you did an authentication of yesterday's session by verbally comparing this short authentication string with the other party, that locks out a man-in-the-middle attack on the first call. But it also precludes there being a man-in-the-middle attack on the new call, because if there was no man-in-the-middle attack yesterday, that means that the attacker doesn't know what you put in the cache from yesterday's call. And if he doesn't know that, that means he doesn't know the new session key. And so you don't need to compare the authentication string on every call. You need to only do it once. And this is trust on first use. So what we're doing is we're combining this short authentication string mechanism with trust on first use. I mean, everybody in the room has used SSH, I'm pretty sure. How many people have not used SSH? No? How many people have used SSH? So you know that every time you use SSH, the first time you make contact with the remote server, it gives you a public key and you cache that. And then every time you talk again to the same server, when it gives you the public key, again, you compare it with the one you got on the first time. And if it hasn't changed, then, well, you're talking to the same server. That means that if there was no man-in-the-middle attack on the first session, there's no man-in-the-middle attack on subsequent sessions. And they don't use a certificate authority. They don't use a public key infrastructure that's a centrally managed, top-down PKI. You know, they're not doing it the same way that TLS does. They're really relying on trust on first use, TOFU. And that works pretty well for SSH. So ZRTP uses something like that, but instead of caching a public key, it's caching a symmetric key. And every time you do another call, before you delete the current session key, you hash it and replace the old cache entry with the new cache entry. So that cache of the session key changes on every call. And it means that, in fact, it could even be that on the first call, maybe you didn't bother to compare the authentication string because it wasn't a very important call. You were just talking about the weather. But maybe on the second call, or maybe on the 10th call, maybe you just talked about unimportant topics for 10 of these sessions. And finally, on the 10th session, you decide that you're going to talk about something really important and sensitive. So you finally compare the short authentication string. That proves there's no man in the middle on the 10th call. But it also, if it matches, it also proves there's no man in the middle all the way back to the first call. Retroactively proves it, which is quite a relief, you know, even though you talked about just the weather. Or maybe you didn't. Maybe you talked about something sensitive but just forgot to do it. Of course, the flip side of that is that if the short authentication string doesn't match on the 10th call when you finally compare it, it means there always was a man in the middle on all the previous calls. That's kind of you know, you should not have procrastinated. You should have compared it on the first call. So that's how ZRTP does it. It makes use of this unique environment where two human beings with 100 trillion synapses in each of their brains directly participate in the actual protocol. You know, I mean, you might have other crypto systems and products and protocols that have two human beings in them, like instant messaging, but they don't participate in the calculations of the protocol. Here, human beings are applying their common sense and everyday wisdom of being human beings in the world, talking to other human beings, to use their human judgment to decide that they're talking to the person who's reading them these two words that change on every call. And so that's the unique environment that VoIP gives you. And so this is a purpose-built protocol just for that. So another thing you can do is that you can use one protocol to reinforce another protocol. When you build a security association with something like ZRTP, you now have a shared secret with the other party, and you can leverage that to reinforce another protocol. So let's say you're using the Signal protocol. So a lot of these applications that do secure voice also do secure end-to-end secure messaging. So they're combined together in the same product. Well, that's a natural opportunity to leverage one protocol to reinforce the other protocol. One of the things that Signal suffers from is that you have to compare a full-size fingerprint of a public key to make it work. If you don't, you're relying on trust on first use, but you don't know for sure that you started it all with the public key of the other party. If the server turned evil, it's conceivable that it could be giving you the wrong public key. And to verify that that's not happening, you compare the full-size fingerprint in a manner similar to what you do with PGP. And most people don't bother to do that. How many people here have used Signal? Okay, how many of you that use Signal took the time to compare the full-size fingerprint with the other party, with every party you talk to? Only one hand. There's like 800 people here, So that doesn't happen very often. Just like SSH, how many people here have done something to verify the fingerprint that SSH shows you? What, 4, 5, 6 hands, And the entire room has used SSH. Everyone in this room has used SSH. And like 1% of you have done the full-size fingerprint compare. Now, it's not your fault in SSH, because in SSH, you're not even talking to a human. There is no human at the other end. You can't compare the fingerprint. You're talking to a server somewhere. There's no one there. So, but with Signal, you're talking to another human. So you could compare them, but you don't. It's just too much trouble. The last time I made a product with ZRTP and a protocol that was very similar to Signal, I sent a hash of the Signal long-term identity key. I hashed that and sent it in the ZRTP exchange, so that if you verify there's no man in the middle with ZRTP, you're also verifying there's no man in the middle with this Signal-like protocol. It wasn't exactly Signal. Actually, we first called it axolotl, but then Moxie, Marlinspike said, don't call it that. And so I called it Xena, which stands for Xena is not axolotl. I wanted to call it axolotl because I wanted to acknowledge where it came from. But anyway, so when we use the Xena protocol, we send a hash of the public key in the ZRTP exchange. So you can use one security association to reinforce another security association. And the reason why we start with ZRTP to reinforce the other one is because ZRTP is the one that takes advantage of the two humans. And it does it in a way that even your mom could do. Even your mom could compare the two words. Or if she can't, then if you're talking to your mom, you're smart enough to get her to do it. So that's a simpler, it's a simpler environment to try to lock down. A messy, complex environment that is much more difficult to lock down is email. I'm sure everyone here has heard about the Efail thing that came up about a month ago for PGP, or the open PGP mail clients. How many people here they don't know what I'm talking about? No? Okay. How many people do know what I'm talking about? Okay, I'm sort of taking the hamming weight of these two groups. Looks like about half the people. Okay, so about a month ago, there was this very clever attack paper published that found a way to exfiltrate the plain text of a decrypted PGP message. And it doesn't actually break the encryption of open PGP, but rather it exploits the, the weaknesses of the mail client. And the way it works is you know that email frequently has HTML embedded in it, right? I mean, I prefer email that's just flat ASCII or flat, UTF-8, and so it's a simpler behavior. It makes me uncomfortable to have email that goes and contacts a remote server to bring in like a JPEG or something like that. But that's what frequently happens in email clients. If there's embedded HTML, it goes and fetches things from a server to like render images and stuff. And this attack exploits that. So what they do is, if they can somehow intercept a piece of email that is sent to you, they can modify this email to add a little bit of malware, HTML malware, at the beginning of the email. And you know that embedded HTML, when it requests an image from a server, it's got this little HTML tag that says it goes and grabs a JPEG from a server. It's got the file name to get from the server, right? And what they do is they inject this HTML malware at the beginning of the message. And in this, it tries to fetch a file name, but it isn't a real file name. It's actually, it opens the quote saying, please fetch the following file from the server, which is a bad guy server. This is a server that's not your friend. And it says the file name is, and then an open quote. And then, right after that, is your ciphertext. When you get this encrypted email and it's got this HTML malware, your Open PGP plugin decrypts the message. And then it renders the whole email. And that in rendering it under the execution of the HTML parser, it tries to fetch this file name, but the file name, instead of it being a real file name, is the entire plain text body of the message, which came right after the open quote that says, here's the file name to send to the server. So instead of sending a little tiny file name, it's sending this giant 5-paragraph plain text message. That's this massive file name. And it sends that to the server, and the server says, thank you very much for that plain text. Well, I can't find the file, but you don't need it, because it's too late now. I've already got the plain text. And that's the attack. That's how the attack works. So it's not actually breaking the cryptography of PGP or Open PGP. It's exploiting the fact that email clients render HTML. This is an example of what a massive attack surface email provides the attacker. It's better if you didn't have, from a security perspective, it's better that no email should ever have HTML in it, but that's not going to happen. You know, people like the fact that email has elaborate fonts and pictures and stuff like that. So email clients have to watch out for that kind of problem. This also affects MIME, which is another email encryption protocol. And it actually affects MIME more severely than it affects PGP, because PGP has a built-in mechanism for detecting modifications to the ciphertext. Yeah, I don't know if I should try to explain the entire attack, but there's two flavors of the attack. One is to do it the way I just described, and the other is to modify the ciphertext of the message. Even though the attacker cannot decrypt the message, he can try to modify the ciphertext. And PGP has a mechanism to detect this modification. It has a a kind of message. It has something kind of analogous to a Mac. Hal Finney and I designed this in around 2000. And we didn't make it exactly like Macs are today, but we put in, what we did is we put a SHA-1 hash at the end of the message and encrypted it with the same key that the message is encrypted with. And so it detects if the message is modified. And so in the version of this attack that tries to put the hostile HTML malware in the beginning by modifying the ciphertext, we detect that and we could prevent that. But S-MIME doesn't have this mechanism for detecting modification to the ciphertext. PGP does, S-MIME does not. So S-MIME is more vulnerable to this attack than PGP. When I say PGP, I mean OpenPGP, any OpenPGP implementation. So this was a really clever attack, and I really admire the cleverness of the researchers that came across this. But how do we fix that? The problem is that email is absolutely rife with vulnerabilities. It's not just vulnerabilities related to encryption. Even if you don't encrypt your email, you've got the fact that if you receive an email with an attachment and you open the attachment, let's say it's a PDF, you open the PDF. If you're the campaign manager for a presidential candidate, that could mean a foreign intelligence service now has access to your, they get root access to your laptop, and they can exfiltrate all of your mail. And then you lose the election. I mean, well, there's other things that might be required to make you lose the election, but it adds up. Every little bit helps, right? So there are enormous consequences for this. So email, whether it has encryption or not, is rife with such vulnerabilities. It's super dangerous to just click on an attachment. There's also the fact that email is like 98% spam. You don't notice it because your email spam filters are, pretty good at their job. But still, the massive amount of email traffic, the bulk of it is spam. And so that's just part of it, and some of that spam also contains malware. and so email is just inherently a really septic environment. And so, you're much better off if you're just doing end-to-end secure messaging or end-to-end secure VoIP. If you can narrow down the attack surface, every time you do that, you're better off. Another thing about email is that it stays around for a long time, and it sits on a server which is not under your control in most cases. I mean, I have an email server because back during the PGP investigation in the 1990s, I had my email at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. And the government tried to go and get my old email from the time that I released PGP because they wanted to put me in prison and they needed this evidence, right? And so NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, expected that they would get hit with a subpoena to get my email. And so they did a policy change across their entire population of users that they said that they're not going to keep backups for more than 1 year. Not just for me, but for anyone. They just won't keep backups for more than a year. And since more than a year had passed before the feds requested my emails from the time of when I released PGP, NCAR didn't have my backups. It didn't have my email from that period. And so that was a great relief to me because there were things in that email that, that were incriminating. How many people here, I guess everybody, maybe I'm being too presumptuous, how many people here know about the the history of PGP and the criminal investigation to try to throw me in prison for publishing PGP. Really? That's all? That's... Okay, wait, okay, let's do the one's complement of that. How many people here don't know about that? Oh my God. You young whippersnappers. Oh. Well, okay, so maybe I better say something about that. When I published PGP in 1991, at that time, there was no way for ordinary people, not sovereign states, but ordinary people, there was no way for ordinary people to communicate securely over great distances without the risk of interception. There was no strong encryption software at the time. And more importantly, PGP combined that with public key cryptography. And so when I published PGP, it really was quite disruptive. And the government, the US government, tried to put me in prison for publishing PGP because it spread all over the world. And at that time, the government had classified encryption software, strong encryption software, as a munition. And if you export a munitions, you're violating the Arms Export Control Act. It's like if you're sending Stinger missiles to Libya or something like that, you know, you're violating the law about exporting military technology. And so they tried to put me in prison. And so for 3 years, I was the target of a criminal investigation. And so I gained a lot of experience as a criminal defendant then. And, you know, when I watch TV shows like Law and Order, you know, and I see them like talking to the cops, I say, don't talk to the cops, you know. I've developed all these instincts for, you know, how to be a criminal defendant. But after 3 years, they finally dropped the case. And it took a few more years to change the laws. By 2000, we had succeeded in getting the US to drop the export controls. And it wasn't only the US. France had domestic controls on encryption. The French didn't really care so much about export controls, but they cared about domestic use of strong encryption. And they dropped their domestic laws on encryption in the late 1990s. And then finally in 2000, the US dropped its export control laws. And so after 2000, the whole world everybody started using strong encryption. It was everywhere. All the web browsers got strong encryption. The mail clients had strong encryption to use TLS to talk to the mail servers. Strong encryption was everywhere, and it got entrenched. So that's, you know, it was quite unpleasant at the time, but in retrospect, it was helpful for my career. It made PGP more popular. That was not a side effect that the government wanted to have. So I guess maybe I wouldn't be here today on stage if it weren't for the criminal investigation of PGP. So anyway, I see that we have 16 minutes left. I'd like to take a few questions from the audience. Has anybody got any questions? Yes. All right, well, there's microphones here. So run up to the mics. I'm hoping to also make a few points about the monetization of customer data invading our privacy by companies that, as their business model, monetize customer data. And as an emergent property of that, creates divisiveness in the body politic. But I'll do that after a couple of questions here. Yeah.
Okay, so my question is about VoIP security. So how Alice can be sure that she talks to indeed Bob and not to man in the middle, Chris, if Chris is able to pretend Bob's voice?
Yeah, I call that the Rich Little attack because there was a guy in the 1970s who could imitate lots of people's voices, the man of 1,000 voices. It's not just a matter of imitating a voice. It's also, you know, because we display it as words, you know, for the PGP word list, I mean, a lot of people have used PGP in a verified keys, right? and you know that there's a list of words that the key fingerprint can either be in hexadecimal or as a list of words. So if we render this as words instead of hexadecimal, you can actually work those words into the conversation. And if you know the person you're talking to, and it displays Clockwork Pegasus, you know, or you know, ski lift Capricorn or something like that, then you could say, hey, remember the time we went skiing in Colorado, we rode on a ski lift, right? And you know, you have some kind of way to socialize the words into the conversation. And that's not simply a matter, they can't just imitate your voice. They have to have a context, that there's a social context between the humans. That's why I said that there's 100 trillion synapses involved in the calculation. It's not, you know, and also you have to have two humans. You can't do this like between a client and a server. You can't have a robot voice on the server do this. It has to be two organic human brains.
Yeah, right. The case is that you not always speak to a person that you know well and you know the person's voice well.
If you're having a really sensitive phone call that involves really sensitive stuff, you probably know the person. Because if you don't, you're probably not going to tell them a lot of sensitive stuff.
All right, thanks.
Sure.
Hi,
Yeah.
I'm Frank. I was one of the people who raised their hands when you said who's not familiar with my history with OpenPGP and
Okay.
and this has probably been asked a million times. I was wondering, being prosecuted in the US must have been a very scary time for you. At the same time, you probably created OpenPGP from strong ideals. Was there ever a time when you thought, shit, I would have never done this if I would have known what was happening right now?
Well, there were certainly times when I was terrified of going to prison. In fact, I pretty much thought I was going to prison. It was not an assumption. It was sort of empirically supported. You know, I had a conference with a whole bunch of lawyers early on, around 1994, or what? Maybe was it 93? I guess I don't know. Could have been 90. Yeah, it was 93, and I don't know. Maybe it was. Yeah, I think it was 90. It could even have been in 92. But I had this meeting with a bunch of lawyers from EFF, from Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, from private Washington law firms, from ACLU. I think there were 10 lawyers in the room, including my own criminal defense lawyer. And all the lawyers listened to my story about what I'd done, and they concluded that there was no way to stop me from going to prison, that all the lawyers in the room were unable to defend me successfully. Now, my own lawyer was a criminal defense lawyer, and he had more confidence in his abilities. He's more of a creature of the courtroom. All the rest of the lawyers in the room were kind of theoreticians, you know. They wrote amicus briefs and stuff like that, so they didn't have the courtroom experience of my streetwise, criminal lawyer. But still, I mean, I had 10 lawyers tell me that there's nothing they could do, that I was definitely going to go to prison. So that's kind of the subjective experience at the time. But I did not regret doing it. PGP started out as a human rights project from the get-go. It later became a business tool, but at the beginning it was not a business tool. It was a human rights tool. It was a human rights motivated project from the start.
Okay, thanks.
So, while I'm waiting for you to get to the microphone, I want to say a few words about some recent sort of gradual realizations. You know, I mean, I mostly work in communication security, but there's so many other erosions of our privacy. And, there's pervasive surveillance technology. In Britain, there's millions of street cameras. In China, they're trying to cover 1 billion people with surveillance cameras. And behind those cameras are facial recognition algorithms and a fusion of data from different sources to give a comprehensive total information awareness picture, which is a great way to control the population. But there's also other things that are more immediate, and that is social networks. Companies that monetize customer data, and in particular, especially social networks, because it's not just the erosion of privacy that by capturing a voracious appetite of customer data. It's also that the algorithms that drive engagement, they want engagement. They want you to stay on the social network as long as possible. And I'm talking mostly about Facebook, but it's true for Twitter and for other social networks. And that is, it drives engagement. It's optimized for engagement to keep you clicking on articles and clicking on ads. And nothing drives engagement as much as outrage, anger. That really drives engagement more than anything else. And that means that as an emergent property of these sort of, just these blind algorithms that are just trying to drive engagement to get you to click on more ads. As an emergent property of that, you divide the body politic. You divide society. You turn it against itself. And when that happens, authoritarian solutions seem appropriate to the voters. And that's what we're seeing happening now, to the point that we're now tearing screaming toddlers from their mothers and putting them in internment camps, and disengaging the United States from Article 5 of the NATO treaty, and dropping out of the climate treaty in Paris, and turning the G7 into probably going to be the G6. That's what can happen when you have a business model that's optimized by deep learning neural networks to maximize engagement, to take advantage of divisiveness and amplify it in a positive feedback loop. It produces horrible outcomes. And, we've all been worried about these social networks violating our privacy. But it isn't just our individual privacy that is destroyed by these kinds of business models. It's also this kind of emergent property that results in the deeper divisions in society. And that worries me a lot. And I wish I could figure out a solution to that. I have a friend who just started a project to do a replacement for Facebook. It's called OpenBook. It's openbook.org. It's not a single word. It's open-book.org. So he's going to do a Kickstarter campaign and try to produce something that's kind of like Facebook, but with a different business model. We've only got 6 minutes. Somebody wanted to come up to the microphone.
Hey, Phil. I'm enjoying the talk. A lot of mention from complexity science and socio-technical systems engineering, which is something I'm into. But I wanted to ask you if you had any dating advice with respect to security. I don't know if you heard this story out of Silicon Valley, but a young man had bumped into a lady somewhere and asked for her number, and she was going to give it to him. But he was using Signal, and they couldn't get keys exchanged, and she didn't know how that worked. So there's this paradox where we have the security set up, but from the show of hands, people do trust each other a lot on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
So where do we find that balance? When is it okay to just chuck the security stuff out the door and just take the girl's phone number if you're trying to get a date for the weekend?
I would recommend the latter. It's nice to have a secure communications channel, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Come on, let's not all see the same hands every time. Questions? Come on, you're all software engineers. You should have questions. Yeah.
Do you have a theory why it's so difficult to establish entire end-to-end email encryption all over the world for everybody? Why is it so difficult? We have not solved the problem yet, at least from my perspective.
Well, that's a really good question. It's hard because it's based on protocols that weren't designed for encryption, weren't designed for privacy. You know, email is not like an ephemeral message, you know, a message that, you know, you could lose the message, or maybe the message spontaneously evaporates in a lot of these end-to-end secure messaging apps. Email has to stick around for years. You can't destroy the keys because you need to be able to decrypt it 10 years later. So you don't, so forward secrecy is, you can't have forward secrecy. You could try to build another protocol, but if you, as long as you're building it on top of, you know, email protocols, you're kind of handicapped by the nature of email. We want the messages to be ephemeral, but we want emails to be permanent. I mean, people actually take advantage of emails. They have business records, they have contract negotiations, they have, you know, these are like business documents. And so email is just inherently a different sort of problem, and you don't solve it the same way. You don't get forward secrecy, you have to keep the keys around, and every time, and the longer you keep those keys on your laptop computer, the more vulnerable they are to being exfiltrated by, you know, some intel agency or criminals. So it's a much harder problem. And I think that, I mean, you could try to do this on a server, but because servers are better protected than the client, but then you have to worry about trusting the server. But I'm thinking about, I'm working with a company now to try to build an online email service that I want to use Intel's hardware secure enclave. It's called SGX. And I could put PGP private keys inside the SGX hardware enclave. And then the rest of the server can't get to those keys. So you might get the best of both worlds. You have a well-protected server, but you have it accessible only to the user at the end of the communications channel. So that's kind of an improvement. It tries to mitigate the vulnerabilities of both the server and the client. But anyway, yeah.
You mentioned open book. I'm looking at point-to-point kind of world with something like Scuttlebutt and the DOT and IPFS, those kind of things. You might want to comment on that world, how that might help?
Well, you know, I don't have that much experience with social networks. I'm not on Facebook, or, you know, I just don't do social networks. So I'm not an expert on that. You know, I can speak to secure communications, but not so much social networks. Mostly, yeah. I just think about how bad social networks are.
Scuttlebutt is a protocol.
Okay.
Not familiar.
Yeah, I've heard the name, but I haven't gone and read the details of it.
Okay, might be interesting.
Okay, yeah.
Can I ask you something? You told us that there are like two different modes of establishing trust. One of them is top-down, and the other one is bottom-up. There's been a lot of research in the research community with regard to networked trust, like Bayesian networks, or using like distributed PageRank networks. Have you looked into that as well?
Well, you know, there's been a lot of talk lately about trying to protect public keys by using Merkle trees to try to make key servers, when you upload your public key to a server, and then once in a while you check it again to see, you know, give me my own public key, and it gives you your public key. There's techniques that you can use to find out if the server is giving that same public key to everyone else, and having something like a public ledger that is immutable. Merkle trees is one way to achieve that. I mean, there's been suggestions to try to use blockchain to do it too, but I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of things you have to do to make that work. There's certificate transparency. So it's not always just a bottom-up or top-down. There's these other things that can establish some consensus about which public keys are being handed out.
Interesting approach. Something like that I've also used in my own protocol. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I have a question. So you mentioned that the export regulations were dropped by most countries. So,
say that again?
You said that the export regulations were dropped by the most of the countries.
Yeah.
And maybe it's a sign that the encryption itself, it's not a problem anymore. So maybe it's too late to encrypt everything.
Yeah, we now have encryption. I mean, encryption is pervasive. But what I think there's been a resurgence of governments pushing back because in recent years there's been a kind of growth of end-to-end protocols, end-to-end secure protocols. And I think that governments and law enforcement are kind of reacting to that. It's not just like TLS connections to your bank. It's end-to-end that seems to be getting the governments more upset. And we have to, you know, I think we're probably going to have to push back on that against them pushing back on it. We need to protect what we've achieved over the years. And, you know, not let government try to roll back our access to strong crypto. But that's really just, you know, there's so many other erosions of privacy. It's not only crypto we need to worry about. So, yeah.
Yeah, so far most of the protocols and techniques you're talking about are looking at protecting the content of the message. But you might also want to hide who you're actually talking to.
Metadata, yeah.
Yeah, so is there anything on the horizon that could let you hide who you're talking to?
Well, that's easier to achieve with end-to-end secure messaging. With email, it's impossible to achieve because the email protocols require the metadata to route the email. You know, it's got from, to, you know, there's lots of header information. It's got IP addresses in there. It's got, you know, I mean, it also has a subject line. It's got lots of metadata. It's got the timestamps. It's got everything. So, and those things are not encrypted. So that's just how the email protocol has always worked. With instant messaging, it is possible to construct instant messaging protocols that are more resistant to exposure of metadata. But even there, it's not so easy. I mean, take, for example, Signal or Wire, which minimizes logging, or WhatsApp, which uses logging extensively. Because WhatsApp is owned by Facebook, and Facebook wants to monetize customer data. They want to know who you're talking to. They're trying to, you know, build social network graphs, and they're trying to figure out things about you. So they're going to log everything, all the metadata they can get their hands on. But at least it's possible to construct things that reduce the metadata footprint. I mean, my own products, you know, I did Silent Phone when I was at Silent Circle, and we didn't log things for more than a few days because we needed the logs to debug. But after we debug problems, you know, the logs evaporate. First, we thought we wouldn't keep any logs. That was completely unrealistic. You can't debug anything without logging. But we didn't have to keep them around for more than a couple of days. But WhatsApp keeps them around for an entirely different motivation.
Thank you.
Another thing is that traffic analysis is really difficult to protect against. And so if you have a worldwide intel agency watching all the packets moving around through the whole internet, they're going to figure out who's talking to who. Traffic analysis is extremely difficult to protect against. In fact, it's so hard that, I mean, I mostly don't even try. I try to minimize it, but I don't try to eliminate traffic analysis. Yeah.
Yeah, hi Phil. Listen, you've spoken a lot about the encryption of the content, making a message private. But actually the whole Efail bug is possible because one can modify the original content. Would making a content would signing the message mitigate the problem?
Well,
I
you
mean,
could
signing to
certainly,
make the consistency to
both
val- to
PGP
ver-
and
yeah.
SMIME offer a way to sign messages, and you can do that, but I don't like the idea of being forced to sign every message.
Okay.
I don't want every word that comes out of my mouth to become a sworn affidavit that could be used against me in a court of law. You know, I'd like to be able to just have some ordinary communication where I don't, you know, where I don't have to sign something. I'd like to be able to have at least a modicum of deniability.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Hello. I just want to know your opinion about blockchain and cryptocurrency. It involves a lot of crypto and...
My opinion about blockchain.
Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting tool that can be used in some applications. Cryptocurrency is the most obvious example. It can also be used in like supply chains and things where a public ledger could be useful. But I don't really look at it as the panacea that some people look at it. I think you can achieve some of the same objectives with, you know, a database, or, you know, there's lots of things you can do with other easier techniques. I don't like the fact that Bitcoin uses as much energy as the entire country of Ireland. That's a high price to pay for consensus. I'd like to find some other way that doesn't melt the polar ice caps. I mean, we're going to melt the polar ice caps anyway, but I don't want to melt them faster for Bitcoin or whatever proof of work. I think proof of work is a fascinating idea. It was a brilliant insight. My friend Hal Finney did a lot of the early work in that. It's brilliant. But I don't think Hal anticipated that it would reach the point where it's using more energy than the entire country of Ireland. It was Denmark, now it's Ireland.
And on that wildly positive note, can we do a round of applause for Phil?